Hello and welcome to today's session of the course History of English Language and Literature. In continuation with the previous section, we continue to identify the various features of Victorian poetry and try to situate the significance of Matthew Arnold's poetry in Victorian era. Matthew Arnold, one of the significant poets of the Victorian period, lived from 1822 till 1888. He, unlike many other poets of the period, was a thorough classicist by sympathy and training. Accordingly, he had an immense admiration for the Greeks. It said that it almost led his poetry astray. He also believed that all really great poetry is impersonal. Accordingly, consciously, he never set to write any kind of personal poetry. His theory of poetry was quite different from that of the Romantics and also from that of the other contemporary Victorian poets. He believed that the poet escapes from himself and from the conditions of his own world when he is composing a poetry. The result of this period and the result of this belief in such a theory of poetry led him to compose a series of works such as Sodom and Rustum, Tristram and Iseult, Baldredette and Empedocles on Etna. And in all these works, as the titles themselves suggest, there is also a significant influence of the Greek ancient past. And we also note that in structure, in composition and in terms of themes, they are also heavily academic, imitative and bordering on certain unrealistic things. So, since this was more like an academic kind of composition and far removed from his personal elements, there is a tinge of unreality and a tinge of impersonality that continues to come in most of his early works. Maybe for the same reason, Arnold was never a popular poet during his lifetime. It was only a sustained academic interest that brought him back into the canon at a later point of time. Many critics feel that at a later point, he unconsciously moved away from these principles of poetry and went on to write more personal poetry. It's at this time that his best work was done when, ignoring theory, he gave his mind free play. So, the result of this was an immense prolific production of Arnold's personal poetry, which was steeped in the melancholy spirit of the era of transition and also peppered by a lot of heavy burden of doubt. And this also made him quite characteristic and quite representative of the Victorian era as well, because as we have already noted, in the poetry of most of the other Victorian poets, there was a looming fear and an anxiety of tussle between faith and doubt, and we find Arnold also echoing the same sentiments, particularly when he writes about this. He notes, wandering between two worlds, one dead, the other powerless to be born. This line from his poetry is oft quoted when one is talking about the transition from the Victorian period towards the modern period, and also these two lines are quite used often even when one is talking about the many difficulties which loomed over even the modernist period. And keeping in tune with this tendency, it is also possible to say that Arnold's best works are his shorter poems. In fact, he reached much fame and much popularity with some of his works such as the Dover Beach. Dover Beach continues to be seen as a frightening vision of humanity and culture, and even when it was published, it did speak directly and engage directly with the common people of those times, and they could relate with the kind of fear and anxiety that Arnold was trying to portray through this poem, The Dover Beach. And in this poem, he talks about a world which is neither certitude nor peace nor help for pain. And even in the modernist period, Dover Beach became a symbol of all these sort of uncertainties and anxieties which were beginning to loom over the British people from the end of the Romantic period onwards. Another significant shorter poem of Arnold is The Scholar Gypsy, in which he tries to capture the tensions between modernity and the disappearing pastoral ideal. So, keeping in tune with the spirit of those times, like Tennyson and like Browning, we notice that Arnold also is someone who is quite nostalgic about the past, and much of his poetry is rooted in the sense of disapproval of the modernity and his sense of anxiety about whatever is disappearing fast from the modern times. The Scholar Gypsy has a very interesting plot structure. It talks about an Oxford scholar who abandons his college education to study gypsy lores, and eventually we find that his colleagues somehow lure him to come back to continue his education, and this scholar also finds, much to his dismay, that whatever he was looking for, the vision that he was looking for in terms of the pastoral, has already been taken over by the fast-paced industrialization which was happening in England. Towards the end of his career, we find Arnold shifting towards more prose writings and moving away from poetry, and this was also the foundational period in terms of literary criticism. We find Arnold contributing much to the growth of literary criticism and also becoming one of the foremost modern critics of English literature. He inaugurated what has now come to be known as cultural criticism. Particularly significant is his contributions in his work Culture and Anarchy, published in 1869, this was considered as a defense of literature. He also tried to define culture in the context of literature and the many other artistic products of those times. His essay in criticism had two editions, in 1865 and in 1888. It was followed by the study of poetry in 1880. In both these works, he spoke about what has later become quite significant in the literary critical methods. He believed that certain poets provided the standards by which all subsequent literature could be judged. Though many later critics had differing opinions about this, Arnold continued to believe that writers such as Shakespeare, Milton and Wordsworth could be seen as touchstones against which the quality of other poetry and other poets could be judged. He also composed the function of criticism at the present time and is now considered as one of the most important literary critical figures who have laid the foundations of English literary criticism. Moving away from Arnold's poetry, we now take a look at Hugh Clough. He was one poet who suffered a major spiritual crisis. In fact, science did not seem to offer much courage or stability either. So he was one of those rare poets who lost his faith both in religion and also in the scientific aspects of those times. So left with any kind of anchor to hold on to, we find him composing two important works, The New Sinai, in which he rejects science, and East Day, in which he rejects the very event of resurrection itself. So with this rejection of Christianity and the rejection of science, he tries to look for other kinds of inspiration and other kinds of anchors which he finds a little bit in the love poetry that he composed, the Botty of Tobana Wallick. We find him turning towards a more romantic kind of writing, because much of his later poetry was dominated by great visual imagery and natural scenes. So we cannot really consider him as a true Victorian poet in that sense, but nevertheless it's possible to do so, because this shift towards the early romantic period was also because of the dilemma and the confusion that he faced because of the tussle between science and faith. And one thing that he shares with the other Victorian writers is that just like the writers such as Tennyson and Browning, he was also deeply influenced and deeply enamored by the events of the past, and he always longed to bring back and recreate the past England through his poetry. Other significant writer alongside these other Victorian poets, Algernon and Charles Swinburne. Swinburne in fact first appeared in the literary scene as a dramatist. And it's important to note that during this time, most of the writers considered it important to experiment through different forms of writing before they really understood what exactly was their call. So finally, we find Swinburne settling to poetry with his 1866 publication, Poems and Ballads. He also tried several themes and forms throughout his poetic writing, and we find him opting the elegiac mode with the work Ave at Val in 1867, and two of his works, A Song of Italy published in 1867 and Songs Before Sunrise in 1871, they engaged with historical events and politics. So even when the age was torn apart through various crises of faith and various difficulties in terms of personal belief systems, we find some of the writers such as Swinburne focusing on the historical events and politics of those times as well. We shall also be coming back to take a detailed look at Swinburne when we look at pre-Raphaelite poetry. James Thomson was another writer who wrote a series of poems under the title The City of Dreadful Night. It was first published in 1867, and later a book form was released as a series during the time 1870 and 74. In this particular work, we find him presenting a searing portrait of modernity, and we also notice that from the end of the 19th century onwards, again a kind of transition is being signaled towards a new phase, the modern phase or the modernist phase. And we also find writers such as James Thomson anticipating the dystopic visions of Eliot and other modernists who were to start writing from the 20th century onwards. And one of the most significant opening lines of James Thomson's work is As I Came Through the Desert, in which he talks about the contemporary period as a desert. Edward Fitzgerald's contribution to English literature is of immense importance. He is best known as a translator of Omar Khayyam's Persian work Rubaiyat in 1859. And this was a work which enabled a revival of interest in the Oriental, and we noted even in the one of the previous sessions that there was a growing interest in what is now understood as the Oriental fiction. In this work, we find him introducing to the English readers a world loaded with images of Arab excesses, luxury and wealth. And Rubaiyat, though it reached the English world through the translation, it also became hugely successful and immensely popular. And in this work, there was also, in stark contrast to the looming melancholy of the times, there were elements of desire, merrymaking, mortality and hedonism. So, it also came as a welcome relief to the other kinds of poetry which we are talking about, the tussle between faith and reason, and also the various difficulties that people were facing in terms of their engagement with the belief systems that they had. When one engages with the exaggerated metaphor and image of rubaiyat, which is also preserved in the translation of Fitzgerald, one is also forced to recall the English metaphysicals who lived in the earlier time. It is one more thing that markedly defines the translation of rubaiyat. 1857 significantly also was the year of publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species, and this work was to forever alter the ways in which thinkers and the writers and even the common man was to understand many things about their own selves. So, with this note, we begin to wind up today's session, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session. Thank you for listening.